Великой Победы! Ура!
Unless you've been living under a rock, you've heard about what Russia's up to these days, invading sovereign countries, annexing chunks of land, and committing war crimes. Vladimir Putin seems determined to repeat the sins and mistakes of Slobodan Milosevic and Saddam Hussein. Meanwhile, the Russian people continue to suffer in a society which has horrible living conditions. Poverty and crime are rampant, while power is held by billionaire oligarchs and their political stooges. In the next few minutes, I'll explain why this was not inevitable. Russia could have become a prosperous and democratic society if different choices were made. First, it's worth pointing out that Russia has suffered under authoritarianism for hundreds of years. The czars ruled with an iron fist, with their power only checked by the occasional powerful noble, or later on in the Russian Empire, the very weak Duma. Wealth, too, was held by the Russian nobility, with the vast majority of the country being impoverished farmers often dependent upon their landlords for survival. These conditions, alongside the devastation of war, triggered the communist revolution and led to the creation of the Soviet Union. But while men like Lenin and Stalin promised to elevate the proletariat class, in truth they monopolized power in their own hands and murdered millions in programs of political and class purge. Now, these dictators did industrialize the country through force. That allowed the Soviet Union to survive the Second World War, despite the mass murders and casualties inflicted by Nazi Germany. After Stalin's death in 1953, the leaders of the USSR swayed back and forth between Stalinist absolutism and cautious reformism. In the late 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power and committed the USSR to the greatest liberalization ever attempted in the country. Economic decision-making was decentralized, people were finally able to speak of the sins of Stalin, and the Communist Party began to loosen its grip on politics. Meanwhile, Gorbachev and the leaders of the Soviet Republic signed a treaty to create a new union with decentralized power. This proved too much for the absolutists, who attempted to take power for themselves in a 1991 coup. While this attempt failed, it permanently crippled the Soviet government, leading to its collapse. Afterwards, the USSR was divided between its constituent states, with the largest being Russia. The first Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, was at least warm to the idea of friendly relations with the West. Meanwhile, a vast program of economic liberalization called shock therapy was attempted. Attempted because it didn't work. The means of production were only seized by party men who became the oligarchs of today. The people as a whole, now stripped of state aid, became poorer, while crime and decay proliferated. In the face of economic crisis, the Russian legislature clashed with Yeltsin. Tensions escalated until the legislature impeached him, but Yeltsin responded by storming the legislature and seizing power for himself. In 1996, he won in a rigged election against the communists. Within a few years, he turned over power to Vladimir Putin, an insider of the security apparatus. Putin has ruled Russia in one form or another since then. He has courted nationalists who wish to see the reignition of a Russian empire. Absolute political power, once held by the Communist Party, is now held by United Russia. Putin and his ilk reject Western democracy and liberty as degenerate and instead enshrine the church, the nation, and the traditional family. Putin is Mussolini with nukes. Unwilling to challenge the power of the oligarchs, he's the biggest of them all, Putin has redirected the attention of the Russian people to wars of imperial expansion against Islamists in Chechnya and against Georgia and Ukraine, which are mostly democratic countries which are grown closer to the West. While plenty of people talk about Russia as the greatest challenge to the Western world order, Russia is a paper tiger. It is a deeply impoverished and dysfunctional state whose decaying military is only strong enough to occupy small parts of its much smaller neighbors. History happens twice. First as a tragedy, second as a farce. But was this inevitable? Some argue that Russian authoritarianism, having been here for hundreds of years, will be here for another 100 years, that after so long, democracy could never grow in Russia. But democracy has only grown in places after hundreds of years of authoritarianism. That's how it works. Some argue that geography, Russia's vast size, means that only an authoritarian government can survive. Russia's the biggest country, but there are large democracies. Also, Russia's not the most populous country, and it's the people, not the land, that form governments. Others say that Russian society is authoritarian in nature inherently, but society can change and evolve. Russia abolished serfdom before America abolished slavery. We need to look at the political events of the 1990s where Russia came the closest to democracy to see how history could have gone differently. The 1991 coup led to the collapse of the USSR. The revolution that followed was too quick for democracy to grow and survive. What could have gone differently? Well, President Gorbachev was warned. He was warned countless times by his allies that a coup was coming. He even met with some of the men involved beforehand and warned them against trying anything. He thought that was enough. In an unprecedentedly stupid move, Gorbachev decided to leave Moscow and go on vacation when his position was most challenged. It was in this absence of wisdom and leadership that the USSR collapsed. If Gorbachev had listened to the warnings and made moves against the coup plotters, who nobody really supported anyways, then the coup never would have materialized. Okay, so Gorbachev stays in power. What happens next? Well, the coup was launched when it was to prevent Gorbachev from signing, the next day, this new Union Treaty I mentioned. If there was no coup, the USSR would have reformed into the Union of Sovereign States, where the central government in Moscow controlled the federal military and foreign policy, but the constituent states had authority on other matters. By avoiding the chaotic collapse of the USSR, this new union would have allowed for a more gradual transition to market capitalism and to democracy. Now, the Union government would likely clash with Yeltsin and other reformists on how quickly to embrace capitalism. But in real life, Yeltsin almost lost power. So if the Union was still around, then Yeltsin would have been kicked out of office and a more moderate Russian president, of which there were many contenders, would be put in power. With no shock therapy, new economic regulations could be put in place to prevent the centralization of wealth and the rise of a new corrupt oligarchy. With lesser devastation, the Communist Party would fade and the nationalists would never rise to power. Instead, sensible moderates would lead this new union. Just look to Poland, which, after communist rule, elected Christian Democrats and moderate socialists. Now, not everything would be rosy. The transition would doubtlessly increase poverty and lead to conflicts in peripheral regions like in Transnistria, the Caucasus, and maybe Tajikistan, just like in real life. But this new union would provide a good forum for those grievances to be addressed in a cooperative manner. And the ex-Soviet countries could have economically recovered from the 1990s downturn just like other ex-communist countries. The export of oil could provide for the material success of this new union. It just needed to be distributed more equally. Now, initially, the union would probably have not so great relations with the West. The US preferred Yeltsin. But in real life, Russian-American relations soured in the 2000s when Russia invaded Georgia. The Eurasian economic recovery in this scenario would nullify the support for such imperialist expansion. Also, aggressive wars would probably be difficult to pull off with the new Union Constitution. So the Union would eventually grow closer to the West, especially as it shed the last of its communist-era policies. Now, of course, I don't necessarily think the Union would last forever. It would probably fade away over the years into some sort of Eurasian Union, inspired by the EU to the West. But it would lay the foundations for a more prosperous and a more democratic society in countries like Belarus, Kazakhstan, and of course Russia. Is this scenario likely? Honestly, probably not. The transition from tyranny to democracy is often a winding road. Just look to France, whose revolution turned to bloodshed and imperialism. But the fact that Russia came close to democracy shows that Russia can be a democratic society in the future. Remember that quote I said earlier? That history happens twice. First as a tragedy, second as a farce? That was said about Napoleon III, who seized power in the French Republic and ruled as an emperor for many years. His downfall brought France to democracy. The same could happen in Russia. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe. And if you have any comments or suggestions, put them below. Thanks.